Welcome to the Institute for Catastrophic Loss Reduction's Friday Forum for Friday, February 10th, 2023. I'm your host, ICLR Chief Engineer, Dr. Keith Porter. This is one in a monthly webinar series hosted by ICLR, Canada's leading source for disaster resilience knowledge. Each month, we present recently completed research or other work related to our mission to make Canada more disaster resilient. Last time, we brought you Laura Zizzo and Émile Laverne of Manifest Climate, who told us about how firms can manage and disclose their climate risks in light of a draft guideline from Canada's Office of the Superintendent of Financial Institutions. The slides and the video from that talk are available at ICLR's website. Next time, on March 10th, Ryan Kolker of the International Code Council will tell us about the resilience benefits of off-site construction. Today brings an interesting change of pace from our past talks that tend to focus within a single discipline. Our speaker is Professor Rodrigo Costa from University of Waterloo, who will give us an interdisciplinary presentation at the boundaries between sociology, engineering, and natural disasters. Professor Costa works in systems design engineering at the University of Waterloo. I'm very excited about his talk because, like many other disaster researchers who approach catastrophes from an engineering perspective, my studies of disasters tend to focus on monetary impacts. I've generally monetized environmental and human impacts such as carbon emissions, deaths, and injuries, and I add them to monetary impacts like many other people do. But to the people affected by disasters, those monetary factors can be secondary to personal motivators. Dr. Costa will show us a little about how to view disasters through the eyes of those affected by them. He will discuss place attachment, the deeply rooted bonds individuals develop with their communities. And he will speak about people's decision-making about permanently moving away after a big disaster. But before our speaker begins, let me remind you of our agenda. Our webinar will last 90 minutes. Our speaker will present for about half of that time, and then I'll moderate Q&A for the rest of the time. Please feel free to chat your questions into the Q&A box. I will try to pose your questions in the order they appear in the Q&A box. If we have a lot of questions, I may only pose your first one, then move on to others, then circle back to your additional questions. Our webinar is recorded, and we will post our speakers' slides and the link to the video on Monday or so. So if you have colleagues who could not attend, please let them know. And now I will turn the podium over to Professor Costa. Take it away, Rodrigo.
All right. Thank you very much for the kind introduction, Keith. So my name is Rodrigo Costa. I'm an assistant professor in systems design engineering, and I want to talk to you a little bit about how can we model disaster impacts as well. And I'm very glad for this opportunity here. As I was doing my PhD at University of British Columbia, ICLR has always been an entity that I always look up to, and it's very nice to be here participating as a speaker now. So the topic of today's presentation is place attachment, an important social dimension in post-disaster population displacements. And let's see how we can try to incorporate place attachment in our risk assessments. So I believe it's not a novelty for anyone here, but I just wanted to emphasize that communities across the world, they are subject to risks. Some of those risks are related to extreme natural phenomena. We can be thinking about wildfires, hurricanes, tornadoes, floods, tsunamis, and many others. The focus of the conversation here today will be on earthquakes, but many of the concepts that I'm going to be discussing here could be expanded towards these other hazards. And again, as most of you may know, the number of catastrophes across the world have been increasing over the last few years. And perhaps even more concerning is the fact that our uninsured losses have been increasing. Those losses are borne by people that will have to make drastic changes to their lives in order to cope and recover from those disasters. And Canada is not an exception in terms of this increasing disaster losses. We can see that we have a few major disasters that happened in the last few years. But one of the interesting things we can see in this data here is that over the last decade, there's just 1 year, 2015, where we didn't have at least $1 billion in disaster losses in Canada. So this is a very relevant problem for us here. And late last year, during the 2022 World Economic Forum, many of the leaders that were there were asked to rank what their main concerns are for the short term within the next 2 years, in the long term as well. You can see that in the short term, there's a lot of people concerned with cost of living, but in general, there's the topics that people are concerned about are quite varied. But there's somewhat of a consensus that when we think about 10 years from now, many of the risks for the world economy are related to extreme natural events. And many of those can be tackled through disaster risk management. The question then is, how can we make this management decisions in a way that promotes equity and it's helps us get to a more resilient future? So most of my work focuses on regional risk assessments, earthquakes being the main focus of that, but wildfires and floods as well. So what I want to start here is to give you an overview of how this loss assessments are conducted at the regional level. I imagine that many of you are familiar with many of the things I'm going to be covering here, but this will provide us an even ground for everyone to understand the second part of this presentation. So let's say we're interested in figuring out what would be the impact of a large earthquake on a San Andreas fault. What would that cause to the people of San Francisco? By large, I mean 7.0, which is a 7.2, which is what the city been planning for, or perhaps even a 7.9 earthquake, which would be a repeat of the 1906 earthquake that caused a lot of damage to that community. So in a brief overview here, in order to conduct this assessment and try to understand what those impacts are, what is traditionally done is we start with an exposure model. We try to understand what are the types of infrastructure that are subjected to that hazard. In a lot of cases, that exposure is conducted at the census block level, because that's the data that is more easily available. And we try to understand, for example, what is the fraction of wood frame buildings in that census tract or the concrete buildings that exist in that area. And we use this data to identify what is the best fragility model that we can use to simulate that building. So those fragility models, they take as input a metric of shaking intensity, could be PGA, could be SA, or spectral displacement, and they compute what is the probability that a building will be damaged given a certain level of shaking intensity. The next part is, of course, to model the hazard. So if we're focusing on earthquakes, we need models for the ground motion, propagation, what's the likelihood of observing a certain magnitude. We need some soil data. And with those, we know what is the distance that you have to our epicenter. And with that, we employ something that is called a probabilistic seismic hazard analysis, which has a somewhat complex equation here, but it's not that complicated to implement in reality. And we also have to account for spatial correlations because we're talking about an entire city. So it's not just one infrastructure that we're interested now. We need to determine how those correlations will affect our shake intensity across our community of interest. So with that, we're able then to estimate what's the expected shaking given a specific realization of an earthquake. With that, we have all the parts of the model we need. We have those exposure that tells us what the fragility curves we should use for each building is. And we also have the hazards telling us how much shaking there will be. So we enter those fragility curves with that shake intensity and we estimate damage. If we know the value of the buildings or the replacement cost of those buildings, we can then estimate what would be the repair cost given a certain level of damage for each one of those buildings. And this is, in a nutshell, how we can conduct this type of regional loss assessments and how that's traditionally done. The question then is monetary loss a sufficient description of the disaster impact? Unfortunately, we have seen in the last few weeks the devastating impacts of the earthquake that happened in Syria, between Syria, Turkey, and Lebanon. And it's very easy to imagine that there's a lot of other problems beyond just how much it will cost for us to repair the damage. There are many families that were affected in ways that monetary losses may not be the best descriptor to show that. But even when we are talking about earthquakes or disasters in general that could happen in Canada or the United States, even though we use losses as a common metric of what people would need after a disaster, those losses can skew the decisions that we find appropriate. For example, if someone lives in a very large home, even a minor damage to that large home could result in much higher losses than someone who lives in a much cheaper home or deteriorated home that is completely destroyed by the disaster. So if we're just basing our decisions in terms of the losses that each person experienced, we would erroneously say that the person in the bigger house has higher post-disaster needs because they have more losses. So, and that's why many of our disaster response efforts in recent years have led to an equal distribution of resources. Certain groups have suffered more over those disasters, those including but not limited to households led by women or households where the householder is a person of color. So one of the challenges that we have here is that many of the tools that I was just describing, this type of analysis, this type of looking into disasters from the perspective of losses, those tools, they were developed for insurance purposes. They was trying to understand what would be the monetary losses, so we could determine, for example, what the premiums could be for an insurance policy. And those tools are useful. They serve their purpose. I'm not saying that that's not the case. What I'm saying is that those tools may not be the best when we're talking about decisions made by the public sector. The public sector is not trying to identify what the potential losses could be annually or the next year, but they're thinking about long-term decisions. We're talking about community resilience and trying to ensure the well-being of our communities in the long term. So perhaps we need to improve or expand a little bit of the tools that we currently use in order to employ that to help the public sector make those decisions. Another way of thinking about that is to think about what is a disaster, what causes a disaster. So a disaster is not an earthquake or a hurricane. A disaster is an intersection of many things. Among them are, of course, the hazards, the extreme natural events, wildfires, floods, hurricanes, earthquakes. The second thing is the exposure, which is what is in the path of that disaster, the buildings and the people. And our current approaches tend to account for that, but in many cases, they do not account for vulnerabilities, especially if you're talking about vulnerabilities of people, not only the vulnerabilities of the infrastructure. And fourth item in thinking about disaster risk is also to think about the coping capacity. A $50,000 loss is very different for a family that doesn't have a lot of resources compared to a family that is much wealthier. Or having your home damaged might be very different for someone who has a large social network within a community compared to someone that has recently moved in a community and doesn't know anyone. So if we're trying to understand disaster impacts from a holistic perspective that accounts for hazards, exposure, vulnerabilities, and coping capacity, then we have to start thinking about some societal impacts of that disaster. We have to look into more than just that immediate losses, either they're translating your dollars or not. So I started looking into this problem and try to understand how can we develop a more comprehensive metric of disaster impacts. And one of those metrics that I've been interested about, not the only one, there are multiple other metrics that are as important as the ones I'm talking about today. But one of those metrics is population losses. There is a document that was developed by the city of San Francisco in 2016 in which they outline their concerns in terms of their disaster risk. And one of the main things they're concerned about is the potential of population losses. What San Francisco is worried about is that perhaps after a large earthquake, many of the population of San Francisco would move out and they would not come back to the city, because that is translated in many cases to losses of income from taxes or a loss of social cohesion within that community. And in general, it's something that communities want to avoid. We can look at, for example, the example of New Orleans after the Hurricane Katrina. The city lost population basically permanently. I believe the city has not recovered pre-Katrina levels of population until today. So if we're trying to understand population's losses after a disaster, I started questioning myself, so why are some of the reasons that people would leave, or they would not repair their homes? They would just perhaps sell their homes and leave, or perhaps just abandon their homes. So I feel things are a little easier to try to speculate about. And one is that it may cost too much. If you don't have the resources to repair your home, you might be forced to leave. And that cost is partially captured for using the approaches that we have currently, because our approaches are focused, they tend to focus on losses. But on the other hand, it might take too long. Maybe there are governmental assistance, there are programs that allow you to get the money eventually, but that eventually might take years. Or perhaps there are not enough contractors in the city. We've seen that happening in post-recovery from wildfires in California, where work shortage was a big problem that delayed recovery for a lot of people. But are there other factors? Are there other things that people are worried about in terms of making that decision to repair their homes after an earthquake or not? And I think that to capture all of those, we need some innovative approaches. So in terms of developing these innovative approaches, what I started working on this problem, the first thing I identify is that the type of analysis that is done at the census tract or census block level was no longer sufficient for what I was trying to capture. Instead of that, I started developing an approach based on parcels, based on individual buildings, because I wanted to tie individual buildings and individual properties. So how can we get that data if we want to work at the individual building level? One of the ways to do that some cities have that data available, the majority don't, unfortunately, but is to use tax assessor data. Tax assessor data allow us to identify for each parcel in a community, what are the market characteristics of that building? What is the value of the building? What is the area when the building was built? With that type of data, we can also use something that was developed by FEMA called the Houses Building Inventory Manual that tells us, at least for the US, based on certain properties of a building, when they were built, what type of, what's the area of that building, how many floors the building has. It allows us to estimate what the structural characteristics of that building would be, and even estimate what the replacement cost for those buildings would be. So this combination of tax assessor data with this hazards inventory manual allow us to get some data at the individual building level. Then, once we have this data at the individual building level, we can bring into some census data about demographics. We have distributions for income, ownership, race, ethnicity, any other variables that we would like to. We can start tying specific households from specific demographics to each building in our community. And from that, instead of working with a building portfolio, we could start thinking about a household portfolio in which we have properties or data about buildings, but also data about the occupants of their building. Not necessarily something that will allow us to identify who that person is, but to have an idea of what their capacity to raise funds or other demographics of them that are relevant for post-disaster recovery. So what I'm proposing here is that we take that approach that we currently have developed, and it's very well established, that simulates repair costs at a community level, but we bring in those demographics and start thinking about modeling societal consequences of disasters, especially long-term societal consequences. So during my PhD and over the several years since then, I've been working into developing models that will allow us to input those loss estimate maps that are generated by our more traditional approach to simulate disaster impacts. And I develop a model that I call those the recovery assessment agent-based interdisciplinary tools. And those models allow us to estimate what recovery would look like for a community and start changing the conversation from loss estimates to an estimate of recovery hardship for individuals. So to develop this model, I, of course, relied a lot on literature review, including many fields outside engineering, such as planning, social sciences, economics. I also look at demographic data, trying to understand what makes a household more vulnerable from a socioeconomic perspective. I also dig a lot through how disaster finance happens, and this was particularly for the US, trying to understand all the possible sources of financing that families could rely on. But then I had conversations with people that work on the ground to try to understand, is what I'm trying to model here something that kind of resonates with what you've seen in your experience working in this field? I also participated in multiple roundtables with disaster managers, in which from there I also took some lessons. And of course, I also included in this modeling approach the capacity to simulate the availability of workers that would allow us or be a bottleneck for disaster recovery. I'm going to give you a glimpse of what is included in this model in the next few slides here, but I don't expect you to understand all the aspects of it. It's just to show you that there's a lot that needs to be accounted for. The first thing is that recovery financing. So, like I said, I don't expect you to read through this plot, but just to try to tell you some of the work that goes into this. We're trying to understand how people would finance the repair of their homes after a disaster. And they may rely on funds from insurance, from FEMA, from SBA, from bank loans, or from HUD through the Community Development Block Group Disaster Recovery Grants, or CDBG-DR. And we created models for each one of those, the likelihood that people would be approved by, and the likelihood that people would receive sufficient money from each one of those sources. So if you're interested in getting a little more look under the hood into this specific model for recovery financing, I have a reference of the paper we published on that. But we also simulated, another aspect that we simulated is this demand for contractors. So in the model, we can assume that households, if their homes are destroyed by a disaster, they need to get some funding to start the repairs. But once they get that funding, they need to get a contractor. And we simulate, in this model, we account for the fact that households will convey that demand to local contractors. But in cities such as San Francisco, for example, there might not be enough contractors locally, and those local contractors, they may pass whatever demand that they cannot meet themselves into out-of-town contractors. And we model this dynamics of between local contractors and out-of-town contractors and the families in need of repairs to simulate either what would be the demand for local contractors, for out-of-town contractors, or even to simulate what would be the demand for temporary housing, because some of those contractors may need to be allocated in temporary housing after a disaster. And again, if you want to go into a little more detail into these models, I have the reference for you here. So what these models allow us to do is to simulate, let's say we have a certain number of homes within a community, there's a shock, and many of those homes are damaged. They are not necessarily habitable immediately after the disaster. And over time, we simulate how many people are still in need of repairs to their homes, how many households have obtained the financing that they would need, but also the availability of contractors. And we do that multiple times to get some understanding about the uncertainties in this process. And then what we get out of these simulations is a plot like the one I have here. So here I have the estimated recovery curves for the city of San Francisco following different levels of earthquakes, magnitude 6.5, 7.2, and 7.9. And here, these curves are showing you that recovery could extend for as long as 8 years for certain groups that would have more difficulty getting the financing that they would need. But one thing that you can say here is that if recovery is going to take that long, some people may not be willing to wait that long. So with this model, we are able to understand a little bit more about how much it would cost, where people get their money for each one of those things, but also that in some cases, recovery may take too long. It takes too long for the money to be available, or it takes too long for the workforce to be available. So with this approach, we could tackle the first two parts, but there's still the question of, are we missing anything? Are there any other things that we should be considering? So one of the things that we imagine we could do some work on was like, is this decision, like, should I rebuild or should I not rebuild? So reviewing the literature from the engineering modeling side, there are two ways in which people have modeled the decision of people to rebuild after an earthquake or not. And some of them model that just as everyone will rebuild as long as they have the funding. And some others have decided that people will rebuild, but they will first look at housing market trends or what their neighbors are doing, and they'll make a decision that optimizes their economic gains in the long term. In short, what the existing models were doing is to assume that homeowners have perfect rationality, that they will make the decision just based on economic factors, that they will just try to maximize their profits in terms of deciding to rebuild or not. But you can imagine after a disaster, if your family is displaced, perhaps you're living in your car temporarily or living with some family or friends, I think it's arguable that even if it's not a decision that would maximize your financial gains, you still maybe want to repair. So I started looking into how can we incorporate some of those aspects. So that's where I looked into what does the literature on the social sciences say about this decision to repair after a disaster. Is it about it's all about money. And the reality is not. Many of the research that I was able to read actually says that economic concerns alone cannot explain this decision to return. There are many people that will return to a community, even if that it's not the most financial productive decision for them. And there are many non-material aspects of the decision to leave or stay. Perhaps you are planning to leave already, so that the disaster is just the last drop in that bucket. Or perhaps your family lives in that community and you really want to stay there because that's where you feel like you belong. And of course, for any of you who have moved cities before, you know that change, even if it's planned, there is some sense of loss when you do that. Imagine having to do that abruptly. So there is a phenomenon called solastalgia that many have described as being, I feel like that you're losing something if you move out of the community where you grew up, where all your friends are, where perhaps your family is. So many of these studies that looked at over multiple disasters, they point to the fact that people are attached to their communities, to their homes, to the place where they live. So place attachment is what we call this rooted bonds, bonds that people develop with their communities. Some scientists call that place identity, place dependence, sense of place, rootedness. Sometimes there's a little difference between the definitions of each one of those terms, but they tend to mean similar things. So one of the most popular frameworks to think about place attachment is this one proposed by Scannell and Gifford. They're both professors at the University of Victoria, if I'm not mistaken. So in this framework, they define that place attachment can be defined based on three dimensions. There's a person dimension, which has to do with the cultural groups that you are associated with, or the individuals within a community to whom you are associated with. On the other side, we have processes. So this dimension of place attachment has to do with your happiness about a certain place, or the memories you developed about that place, or even like your behaviors. But one that is central, and Scannell and Gifford mentioned as being the main descriptor of place attachment, is a dimension that they call the place dimension of place attachment. And that dimension has two subfields, which is physical. So it's like, how are you attached to specific things about your community? Maybe something, a park or a lake that exists in your community, but also the social side. So your friends, your family, everything that is on that community that makes you feel like you belong to it. So this is quite a complicated factor to describe. So how can we even integrate that into modeling and simulations? So perhaps some of you are aware of this study that was conducted by USGS with some other partners called the Hayward scenario, in which this is perhaps the most comprehensive study of regional impacts of disasters, at least the most comprehensive I've seen. So in this study, they investigated the impact of a 7.0 earthquake happening on the Hayward Fault and how that would affect the communities in the Bay Area. So the way they identified that they needed to account for long-term population displacements in their study. So, and they identified that place attachment is one of the metrics that they should be accounting for. But what they did in this study is they make an assumption. They made an assumption that young people with high incomes who are renters, they have higher capacity to move out. They don't, and because of that, they are the people that are more likely to leave the communities after an earthquake. This makes sense, especially for those of you who are familiar with the Bay Area. There's a lot of young, very high welcome people that have perhaps recently moved there for a very nice job in the tech industry. And I think that it makes sense that they made this assumption. However, when the results show that the areas with concentrations of young, high-income renters are the areas with higher chance of losing population, that is not necessarily emergent behavior of their models, it's just a consequence of the assumption they made. So you're trying to avoid that. So in order to try to incorporate this into our models, we focus specifically on that place dimension of place attachment, because that one, like I mentioned, is the one that the authors suggest to be the strongest one. And we decided that that physical dimension or subdimension is associated with your home. How much, like, what is your place attachment to your home? And the social one has to do with your neighborhood or aspects of your neighborhood that you are attached to. And we did that because while place attachment is very difficult to measure, and I don't know of any large-scale surveys that look specifically into place attachment, there are data about home and neighborhood satisfaction within the United States census data. So there are two questions in the census data that specifically ask people to measure on a scale from 1 to 10 how satisfied they are with their homes and how satisfied they are with their neighborhoods. And there are literature on the social sciences, again, that suggests that place attachment and place satisfaction are correlated, even though it's hard to tell if place attachment leads to satisfaction or if satisfaction leads to place attachment. But if we can explore that correlation, that was sufficient for us, because that will give us a publicly available source of data to base our models on. So we started with the relatively simple assumption here. There's a lot of numbers here, but it's a very simple concept that we assume. We assume that low place attachment is a combination of low home satisfaction and low neighborhood satisfaction. So we created this model in which we're trying to say that people with lower place attachment, given their demographic profile, are people that have low neighborhood satisfaction and low neighborhood and home satisfaction. So we just calculated the probability of low home satisfaction and low neighborhood satisfaction, and that would give us the probability of low place attachment. The question then is, how do you calculate the probability of low home satisfaction and low neighborhood satisfaction? And here is where machine learning helps us. So we have this data from the census in which we have all the demographics of the people that responded to the census surveys, and we also have what score they gave to their homes and what score they gave to their neighborhoods. So with that, we use a technique called adaptive boosting. I'm not going to go into detail here, but it's just one of the many machine learning techniques we have, in which we created a model that would tell us what is the housing satisfaction and what is the neighborhood of satisfaction of a person with a certain demographic profile. And we use that census data for San Francisco to then train this model. So what this model told us is that, for example, if we just focus on the first two bars here in this plot, is that, so the dark blue color represents people that were very satisfied with their homes. And we can see that owners tend to be more satisfied, significantly more satisfied than renters with their homes. And there are other demographics here. We can see that the elderly are also, they tend to be more satisfied with their homes than non-elderly residents of San Francisco. There are some other disparities across immigrants, income, race, and other factors as well. And we saw similar results as well in terms of housing scores, how much people are like their neighborhood score, sorry. So with that, we're able to identify what is the likelihood that someone really likes their home and the likelihood that people really likes their neighborhood, or even the opposite. So here's a map with plotting the results that we obtain. So these are results aggregated at the census tract. We're trying to figure out what are the census tracts in San Francisco where people are most or least satisfied with the neighborhoods and housing. Some areas in white, it means that there's not a lot of single family homes, which were the ones we are focusing on here. But as you can see, some areas of San Francisco, such as Bayview in the bottom right corner, tends to be an area that's lower income. And that's the area where also our model suggested that people tend to be the least satisfied with their housing and neighborhood. And according to our assumption, that also suggests that they would have low place attachment. So now we're bringing everything together. So we have this model to give us the probability that a specific person with that someone with a specific demographic profile, they would have low place attachment. Our model from before, all that model to simulate recovery or how people get their funding from different sources. From that model, we could get the probability that the repair costs would be high. And high here we define as being more than 1 year worth of people's income. And lastly, we had a metric of time. So we're trying to understand, like, for which demographic groups recovery was likely to take longer than 2 years. So putting all of those things together, all those probabilities of those different things together, we try to come up with this metric that accommodates both for displaced attachment dimension, but for the recovery cost and recovery time. And we use that to say, we believe that people with low place attachment, whose repair cost is going to be quite high, whose recovery time is going to be quite long, we are assuming that those people are more prone to move out of the community during the recovery process. So applying this model to those earthquakes that I was talking about impacting the city of San Francisco, then we can identify which groups are the groups that are more likely to fall into that condition of having low place attachment, having a long recovery time, and having a costly recovery time. So from left to right here, we can see the lower income persons tend to have a higher chance of checking those three boxes of low place attachment, high repair costs, and long recovery time. Renters also fall. There's a big difference also between renters and owners, with renters much more likely to fall into those categories. And buildings that are low to moderate code tend to have more people in those conditions than buildings at a high code level. So our model, as it is, it's not capable of observing differences across racial groups or immigrants and non-recent immigrants. I'm not arguing that there are no significant differences across these groups in terms of the likelihood that they would have high repair costs, long recovery times, and low place attachment, but our model is not capable of doing so. Our model is not does not have the capacity to capture those differences. And here I have a big plot that has a lot of information here, so I'm going to try to walk you through. So here I'm comparing three approaches to accounting for, to try to understand what groups are more likely to leave a community after a disaster, considering the length of recovery, the cost of recovery, and place attachment. So none means that I'm not using any model. I'm just accounting for if I'm not using any model for place attachment. I'm just considering that people will leave if recovery is costly and if recovery is too long. The Hayward approach is that one approach I mentioned that they use in the Hayward scenario, in which they assume that wealthy renters are the more likely to leave. And lastly, I have the proposed approach. So it's hard to describe exactly what the y-axis here in this figure, but you can simply look at the horizontal red line I have here, and this is saying that whenever a group is far from that red line, it means that there's a significant difference between the different parameters in that group. So the groups that are above that line are groups that are more likely to leave the community after a disaster, according with these three approaches of modeling that. So we can see that all approaches, either if you consider place attachment or not, or using the Hayward approach or using our proposed approach, we see that people in low-code buildings and renters are more vulnerable groups. They are more likely to fall into those conditions and perhaps leave the city after a disaster. The third, and perhaps I think one that's more interesting, is what each one of those models indicate in terms of income. The Hayward approach model says that high-income people are the more likely to leave. They are the more prone to leave the community after a disaster. Whereas the model we are proposing, actually the lower income persons tend to have a higher probability of being into those conditions of low place attachment, high repair costs, and high and long recovery time. And after our literature review, checking what happens in previous disasters in other communities, this tendency of lower income persons to be more prone to having to move to another community after disaster is more realistic. What we saw from the Hayward approach, it's the Hayward model suggesting that higher income people are the ones that are more likely to leave the community. That is not reflected in the literature on this topic. So we believe that our model produces more results that are more in line with reality. So in terms of takeaways, I was talking with Keith before this conversation. What I'm trying to do here is try to think about other ways in which we can think about catastrophic losses when we're doing this risk or loss assessments. I will be delighted if someone in the audience says that the approach we're using is not capturing everything that should be captured. That's exactly the discussion I want to start here. And the goal is us to start thinking about metrics that go beyond just monetary values and start accounting for how people experience disasters and how in the long term those communities that are impacted by disasters are affected, and how we can create models that would help us design policies that lead to a more equitable disaster response and more resilient communities. So with that, I would like to thank you, and I will take any questions you may have now. And if you're interested about any of the work that I'm doing, or if you'd like to learn a little bit more about that, feel free to email me.
Awesome. That was fabulous. Rodrigo, thank you so much. We got 2 questions in the chat, and I have a bunch of questions, but let me ask the questions that our attendees asked first. Slobodan Simonovic asks, do we always want people to remain in the vulnerable locations?
No. That's a good point. So what we are thinking about here is that from the perspective of the city, who is the stakeholder whose side we're taking here, losing that population could be a big impact to them. And also there are some issues with like a lot of people move out of our community, like our community may change quite drastically. So I don't believe that a city like San Francisco we would move everyone out of San Francisco after a disaster. So we are always going to, the city of San Francisco is gonna rebuild eventually. And what I'm trying to bring here is just like, how do we make sure that the people that would want to continue living in San Francisco would have the chance to, if they want to, and if that makes, if that's safe to them to do so. But this question of the matter of risky rebuilding in the same place, yes, that's something that I'm not explicitly accounting for here.
Well, and your model tends to be sort of epistemic. What will people do, as opposed to what should people do, right? One is a sort of a moral or policy making decision, and the other one is about modeling to inform that policy. Chantel Tuck asks, are you including consideration for people who are scared to continue living in this area and choose to move to another city?
No, I'm not. And that's exactly the type of questions that I wanted to provoke here. Is like, what are we not accounting for? So I'm suggesting that place attachment is one of the things we should account for, but risk perception is also something that we should account for. It's like, but in terms of if there are some people that are scared to continue living there, again, assuming that they would want to repair, or that they would make that decision only based on maximizing their own profits, like we have been doing in the literature. I think your question is pointing to the fact that, again, like what have been done in the literature is not accounting for all the facets of this, the decision to stay or leave.
Sure. Adriana Docena says, thanks for an excellent presentation and work. Have any health, including eco-anxiety or community wellness measures, ever been considered related to place?
I don't have a good answer for your question. So I have not come across a specifically study focusing on eco-anxiety related to place, but I cannot also say that there isn't a study about that.
Adriana, maybe you want to chat into the Q&A box if you've got a reference or so on what eco-anxiety is and how people measure it, and what community wellness is and how people measure it. It seems like Professor Costa would be receptive to reading those papers.
Yeah.
Awesome, thanks. An anonymous attendee asks, how do people with no fixed address, homeless people, fit into your model?
The honest answer is that they don't, and that's a limitation. That's a problem. Like in general, whenever you're creating exposure models, very infrequently we account for homeless persons or transient residents of a community. Those are a group of people that are particularly vulnerable and that we have not done a good job at accounting for their needs. So I guess that's another one of those things that we have to start thinking about, or finding ways of accounting into when you're doing this type of risk modeling.
Great. And Charmaline Mendes-Millard provides a link to well-being, and she says there are socioeconomic indices of well-being. So I will grab that URL for you so that I can share it with you, and you don't have to write it down right now. Hang on a second, let me grab that. Thanks, Shermaline. And she says she is happy to connect with people, assume you and anybody else who wants to discuss that stuff more. And
that would be lovely.
Her email address, and I'm grabbing that too. Thanks, Shermaline. Let's see. I'm not sure that the anonymous attendee wasn't the same one that who asked before, so I'll go through to the next question and I'll come back. The next question, Gary Martin says, I love this model. I can see it applied in other situations, for example, how people view risk mitigation measures. Responses are sometimes puzzling, like when a city proposes a flood wall and waterfront residents oppose, or in cases of managed retreat. Could you use this model to facilitate managed retreat? What an interesting idea.
Yeah, oh, thank you for the question. So just maybe a little pedantic in terms of wording here. I would not use this model to facilitate managed retreat, but the model could be used to inform it. So if we believe that people would behave in a certain way, we could use this type of modeling to try to identify if we implement certain policies, there will be take-up from the public or not. So we could get that type of understanding and provide that type of understanding to the people managing the retreat. And from there, they could decide if that is an effective, that will be effective or it will not be effective. So what I'm trying to say is that modeling can always be used to provide insights, but I will not provide a decision with this model.
Before I come back to the next question from the anonymous attendee, let me ask one of my own. I had a role in the Hayward scenario, and a lot of open questions at the end of it. We found that water supply in the East Bay, this is after a big earthquake, water supply in the most strongly shaken area might be unavailable for weeks or months, during which you can't shower, you can't flush the toilet, you can't cook your dinner. And that's, weeks or months is a long recovery time. How long will people put up with that? How long will people with low place attachment put up with not having water before they just move away? And can you tell that from your model? Does it have that kind of resolution?
We could provide some insights on that. So what we're focusing here was specifically the long-term process. We're just trying to think, okay, somehow people are going to be somewhere during this period of time, but they're trying to get their money and their resources to rebuild their home. Perhaps they're living in their homes, they're not 100% fine, that there's some damage to their homes, that they're still living there, and so we count that as another approach we could take is to try to focus the model rather than in this long-term recovery process, just in this maybe a shorter term, bring in the infrastructure side to see if people would have the quality of life. So then our probability of leaving couldn't necessarily not be a function of if people get the funding, or it could be just like a function of how long are you being without water and what is your attachment to this place. So we could modify the model in a few parts to focus on a different problem, which this more like short-term, very critical problems versus the longer term, more like financing versus resources.
But I guess that would involve surveys and actually talking to people and seeing how they would actually react to being without water. Or how would you modifying the model?
So I know that in Canada there are some surveys of disaster risk. I don't know if they call disaster risk perception, but there are some surveys. They're not done together with the census, but it's similar data to the census. They collect demographic data of people and they say, how prepared are you for a disaster? And I believe there might be a question there related to how long people are willing to live in a house or in a city without utilities. So if we have that type of data, then we can use a similar approach, like a machine learning model that could tell us, given a demographic profile, what is the time that people are willing to live. I imagine, for example, people with little children or like elderly in the family, they would have much different needs from like young adults. The question will be like, do we have that data from census or on the source, or we need to survey that in a way to gather the data to build the model?
Fair enough. An anonymous attendee asks, has there been any thinking about how these findings might apply in a smaller community such as Lytton, British Columbia? That's the community that burned down
Yes.
last July or so.
Was it 2021?
Was it 2 years ago? Maybe. It feels like it was just
Yeah.
last year, but I could, yeah. It's kind of absurd that I've forgotten, but anyhow.
Yeah, so I have some studies that we're doing right now on the 2017 fires in California. So we're looking at Santa Rosa, that was partially destroyed. There like some of the building, but there's also Paradise that was completely destroyed. So what we're identifying is that whenever the damage is so much that the entire community is affected, like there's so much destruction that it's hard to look at literature from previous disasters and extrapolate to that one disaster because it's such a unique context. So I don't know right now what's the extent of damage to Lytton. I think it was quite significantly.
Yeah.
So yeah, whenever extrapolating something that we saw in previous disasters, these disasters that are very like concentrated with a lot of damage, it is a little trickier to do that. So I'll be a little cautious on that front.
And you're right, it was June 30th, 2021. Yeah, and what happened was basically the entire downtown burned down. 100 or so buildings burned down. Almost every building in the city center. An anonymous attendee, same one, different one, I don't know, asks, what policy implications of your work do you find the most interesting or promising to tackle the social impacts of disasters?
Mm-hmm. So if the question is asking about my work in general, so I'm going to answer something that it's not specifically focused about this one here, but so I talked to you about a little bit about like the financial piece of this modeling approach. Mm-hmm. So one of the things that we are doing is we're trying to create models in which instead of stopping at the loss, we're looking at like comparing loss to the capacity that people would have to gather money after disaster. We call that unmet needs. So we created a model to simulate that based on historical data. That paper is under review now. But one of the things that since then happened, we had a collaboration with the Department of Housing and Community Development of California. And we are helping them to take our model for financing and advocate along with HUD to change some of the policies on how HUD allocates funds to states in order to do that more quickly and better accounting for unmet needs on the side of the people, like actually understanding how much people are going to get. And surprisingly to us, HUD is actually asking for that information right now. So there's like a call for information from HUD side. HUD is literally asking, hey, we know the way we calculate unmet needs is faulty. Can anyone help us do something? So we're hoping that perhaps our model will be taken by HUD or inform whatever model that HUD's going to create eventually.
Yeah, the White House unveiled an initiative called Justice 40, I think, that makes it a priority of this administration to make sure that government efforts are adequately consider people, disadvantaged populations. So HUD may be responding to the Justice 40 initiative, or they may have helped to lead it. Thanks for your answer. Let's see, Chantel Tuck says, very interesting presentation. Oh, sorry, Chantel just says, thanks very much. Melissa Umberger says, great presentation. Is it possible to share the presentation, or is any of this information public? Thoughts on using these models to advocate to FEMA or HUD the need for more recovery funds for low-income households? And I'll field that for you. You can add if you like, but Professor Costa's deck, we're going to post it to our webpage along with this video. So Melissa, you can share it with whomever you like after about Monday. And I think Rodrigo, you've just covered her question about advocating to FEMA or HUD the need for more recovery funds for low-income households. Do you have anything to add related to her question?
Yeah, so the presentation is public. If you want to take a look at the models, I'm happy to share. There's a lot of code in there, so maybe a little tricky to navigate through it, but I'm happy to share the code I have. So yes, we're trying in other efforts that I'm involved. We're trying to better inform the HUD allocation funds, but also we have another study that we're looking into floods in California, because FEMA funding is only available if there's a presidential declaration. So we're looking into some smaller disasters that could be very damaging to a small community, but it's not enough to trigger a presidential declaration. So we're looking into, okay, what is the gap between the years where there's a presidential declaration where there's not? So that may be helpful to inform the FEMA side of this equation.
Yeah, and actually there's a little thread there that I'd like to pull on. So the FEMA programs like public assistance, those are post-disaster recovery funds, but there are pre-disaster funds available as well, like BRIC. And one of the, you put your finger on one of the really important limitations of BRIC funding decision-making. You said, here's a big expensive house owned by a wealthy person, and here's a little, a poor house owned by a poor person, and the economic losses associated with the economic benefits of protecting the big expensive house can greatly exceed the economic benefits of protecting the poor person's house, but that doesn't sort of reflect the personal impact, right?
Yeah.
And the challenge to taking that fact and sticking it into BRIC grant decision making is that BRIC grant decision making is BRIC is the Building Resilient Infrastructure in Communities. It's a big grant fund. Several $1 billion per year at this point, 6% of last year's disaster losses. Anyway, you have to do benefit cost analysis. And that brings in all of the disadvantages, all the ways that benefit cost analysis disadvantages the already disadvantaged people. But I wonder if there isn't a way to assign a hedonic value to what do you call it? Solastalgia, right?
Yeah, don't call it. That's that's a term that been coined by someone else.
Okay, no, sorry, it was a new one for me. And I know I said, it's terrible that we always quantify all these benefits in terms of money, but sometimes you have to, like for BRIC. Is there a way to assign a dollar value to protecting people's place attachment, to protecting people's sense of place.
Mhm. Yes, I'm completely aware of the argument of like cost is still like it's very easy to communicate. It's a very powerful metric. But I don't know. I don't know if there is a way of communicating every aspects of a person's experience with disasters into a monetary value.
Yeah. Okay. Let's see. Slobodan asks, if you allow, I would be able to share a bit of experience with flood disaster management in Canada and US based on the flood of the century Red River. And Slobodan, I'm not sure that I think that in this format, we can't do that. We can't sort of unmute you and let you speak. It's just not the way that this thing is set up. It's not like our rules or anything. It's just Zoom webinar. But I'd be happy to connect the two of you so you could have an offline conversation. Sorry about that. Let me make that a note. An anonymous attendee asks, how can we account for including place attachment related to people who own businesses in the area, especially if those businesses are place-based?
The how part, it's hard, but I think that we should. That's another thing that is over simplified when we just look at losses in terms of that. But if you're talking about like mechanically in terms of like a simulation, that could be like a flag that some people, if they have a business, like their place attachment is much higher than it would be what we estimate by just their demographic profile. So that could be one way of incorporating this into the model.
Okay. An anonymous attendee says, not a question. I have to leave, but thank you so much for this excellent talk. And I'm looking forward to continuing the conversation with you. And the speaker says, and we at Partners for Action at University of Waterloo do research on managed retreat, and was thinking that, yes, we can use this model to inform managed retreat decisions. Thanks again to you and to ICLR. Thanks, anonymous attendee. You have any to comment on Partners for Action? Do you have any contact with them so far?
I know about their work. Their work is very interesting, and I know who they are. I just need to find time to get a coffee with some of them here. It's like I started at Waterloo in September, so it's been like trying to figure out everything. I'm still getting around, figuring out getting things done here.
Let's see. So those are all the open questions that people chatted, but I've still got one or two left. So there's a community planning organization in the San Francisco Bay Area called SPUR, and they've expressed the opinion that there should be a policy that 95% of people should be able to shelter in place after a big disaster. Right.
Yes.
They would like buildings to be, residences to be that resilient so that if they weren't undamaged, at least you can stay in them. At least 95% of the population can stay in them. And that's a socioeconomic, social level goal. And it's one that expresses those particular people's, the people in SPUR, their preferences. Mm-hmm. Do you think that there's any relationship between that goal and individual people's sense of place? Is there some sort of tipping point where people think that their neighborhood is not worth staying in? So you talked about place attachment and neighborhood attachment as kind of different things. So is there? Do you see any kind of relationship between this idea that if only 5% of people have to move away, that's somehow acceptable, and one's perception that, oh, on my block, only 1 out of 20 has moved away. Is there any connection there for you?
So my understanding of what Spur is concerned about is the fact that there has been like multiple work that suggests that if people are forced to leave their communities, even temporarily after a disaster, they are less likely to come back. And there's also a problem that if people, let's say people from San Francisco, they are displaced to Oakland, they're living with their friends in Oakland temporarily. But then there's a committee meeting to decide what we're going to do about the bridge or something, some infrastructure of the neighborhood that got destroyed. It's not that simple for that person to leave whatever they're doing, come to this committee meeting and leave. So their voices start getting unheard because they are not in that community anymore. So I think their concern is this: they don't want people to spread out along the bay and figure out, okay, maybe I could live in I could live in Oakland and pay less rent and figure out that it's good to live there and not come back to San Francisco. So I don't know if they're necessarily saying that 5% people leaving is not a concern, but I imagine that they're thinking that they're trying to reduce the number of people that could potentially leave the city permanently. So that's my understanding of what they're trying to do there. I don't think that they were specifically concerned about place attachment in that case. It was just more like if people leave, they are more likely to realize that there are other places to live in the Bay Area than San Francisco.
Okay. Carly Benson asks, have you looked at Canadian data sets to see if a similar model could be customized to Canada, or what data might be missing to apply a similar model to Canadian cities? Canada's post-disaster financing policies, for example, are quite different from the United States.
Yes, so you just described my first few years of work here at Waterloo. So I started this model in Vancouver. So I created some of the framework for this model in Vancouver during my PhD. Then I moved to the US for my postdoc, and that's why I've been working into the financing side and some things that are specific to the US. But now I'm back in Canada. I want to apply this in Canada. And the financing side in Canada is simpler. There are fewer agencies that appear to be involved in this. But I want to figure out, are there any holes also in the fact that if there are fewer agencies, there might be more people that are not covered by some of those. So my goal over the next few years here is to explore. I believe the Canadian census data is actually better than the US census data. The US has the American Housing and Community Survey nowadays that fill a lot of the gaps that the census has. But I want to look into microdata from Canadian census data. There is this survey. I don't know if it's being conducted frequently or not, this survey on emergency preparedness for Canadians. I know it was conducted in 2017. I don't know if they have a new version of that. Probably not, but they might have in the recent future or the short-term future. So yes, my goal is to try to answer those questions that you just made. They were very good questions. I believe that we can translate the model into Canada, and that's my goal for the next few years.
Does your finding that poorer people are more likely to move away, how does that relate to our experience in the pandemic, when where we see or can you does the pandemic teach you anything about the effect of wealth on place attachment? Can you get anything about how many people moved away when they lost their jobs or stuff like that?
Yeah, that's a very good question, because that's what started this whole study. Like when I started the study, it was like the beginning of pandemic, and there's a lot of headlines talking about how San Francisco is gonna be ghost town soon because everyone is leaving and whatnot. So when I went into this problem, my belief was that yes, like it's wealth, it's high income people that have a lot of mobility. They are the ones that are the more likely to leave after a disaster. But I was going through the literature on the topic. So there's an important distinction to be made between forced dislocation and voluntary dislocation. Those, in the case of the pandemic, there's a lot of people that work for tech companies in the Bay Area. They're leaving the Bay Area because they're working remotely. They didn't want to pay that high amount of rent, but it was, to a certain extent, it was still a choice, right? It was like they're trying to save some money, but they could stay where they were if they didn't have anywhere else to go. When we're talking about forced displacement, it's like people like they really want to stay, but they can't. Like there's some different nuances there. So in terms of forced relocation, that's where like lower socioeconomic status persons tend to be the majority. But in terms of voluntary, you're right, like higher income people tend to be more likely to voluntarily displace. But the impacts, like the personal impacts of a voluntary displacement versus a forced displacements are quite different.
Understood. Louis-Philippe Caron asks, how will candidate adaptation strategy that implies risk mitigation, how will the candidate adaptation strategy impact your work in Canada, especially for Indigenous people?
I'm not yet familiar with the Canada adaptation strategy, so it's hard for me to answer.
Okay.
Yeah.
Let's see. And I had another question. What you've discussed, you've described is mostly new to me. Can you tell us something about the rest of the research going on in, I don't know, what you would consider this field? Who are the other players? What are they doing? Where's this field going? You know, what can we look forward to sort of learning about in the near term, not just from you, but from your colleagues in this field?
Yeah, it's a good question. So I think one of the things that we are switching to quite strongly now is from like maybe like back in the day, there's a lot of like census-based type of analysis, like they're using houses type of approach. There's a lot of there's incentives because there's some tools that are being developed for that, some databases for that, but also some acknowledgement that we need to move towards more like parcel-based analysis. And now we have like some people creating like satellite imagery-based data sets, like there's like Microsoft buildings. So we're looking more into that. And there's a big push, what I feel at least in this field, is to combine planning, engineering, and social sciences. I think there's multiple groups that are being developed around this problem of disaster risk management. There are truly interdisciplinary groups. There are people like from different disciplines and working together synergistically. It's not like, oh, the engineering part does the law side and give the results to the social scientists and they go from there. There's a lot of work that it's being truly trying to understand disaster, long-term impacts of disasters from a multidisciplinary point of view. And on the modeling side, not necessarily on the modeling side, this first part, but on the modeling side, and there is this idea of pushing towards parcel-based assessments.
Cool. All right. That's all of the questions we have, and there's nothing that makes that says we have to use up the full 90 minutes. So I am going to thank you again. It's a great talk, and I'm looking forward to. I will now look for opportunities to to use your research in my work, and I'll look for opportunity for us to collaborate together. Thanks again. And I want to remind everybody that to join us on March 10th, when Ryan Kolker of the International Code Council will tell us about the resilience benefits of off-site construction. He feels that the future belongs to buildings that you build in a factory, carry out to the field, and they cost less and they can be more resilient. And I'm looking forward to hearing about that. We got one last question, but sorry, Adriana, I already started saying goodbye, everyone. So I will copy and paste your question into an email to Professor Costa, and you can carry on that conversation with him offline. Rodrigo, thanks very much. Bye, everybody. Have a great weekend.
Thank you.